The subcommittee will come to order, and good afternoon and welcome to everyone. In January 2014, ISIS terrorists captured the central city of Fallujah in central Iraq, a decade after it had been won at the cost of so much American, Iraqi, and British blood. ISIS moved north, taking more territory and conducting its genocidal campaign against Christians, Yazidis, and other religious minorities. By early August, Yazidi men, women, and children were trapped on Mount Sinjar, facing annihilation when the U.S. initiated airstrikes to save them. However, beyond that, it soon became clear that the administration had no comprehensive plan to prevent ISIS from continuing to commit genocide, mass atrocities, and war crimes, or to roll ISIS back. This subcommittee, along with that of the Middle East and North Africa subcommittee, co-chaired by my good friend and colleague Ileana Ros-Layton, convened a hearing on the genocide in September of 2014 and called for the administration to act before those communities of Christians and others were annihilated. Meanwhile, across the porous border in Syria, the Assad regime was targeting and killing tens of thousands of civilians. I renewed my call again for a Syrian war crimes tribunal to be established to hold all sides in the conflict in Syria accountable. And we had heard from such great leaders, the former chief prosecutor who will testify today, David Crane, about the importance of taking action in a tribunal that had the flexibility and the capability to really hold people to account on all sides. The world knew that ISIS was committing genocide. Civil society groups, including some present at this hearing today, mobilized, writing letters, and holding meetings with the administration, making statements and reporting stories. Matter of fact, parenthetically, my first hearing that I held here in this room was more than 3 years ago on the genocide against Christians. And it's like, you know, why was there such a indifference on the part of some within the administration? However, some members of the administration were pushing hard internally for the word genocide to be publicly spoken and for action to be swiftly taken. Yet the administration still had not acknowledged it and still had no strategy to prevent it from happening. Such was the situation in December of 2015 when this subcommittee convened yet another hearing. Shortly after the Congress passed and the President signed into law the fiscal year 2016 appropriations bill, the omnibus bill, which required the Secretary of State to report to Congress with his evaluation on whether ISIS had perpetrated, I should say. Perhaps the most important push outside the government and off the Hill was the 280-page report commissioned by the Knights of Columbus and developed in partnership with the tireless organization In Defense of Christians, meticulously documenting the genocide against Christians. That report may have made the difference with the administration, so I'm personally grateful to Carl Anderson, Supreme Knight, who is here to testify again, and for the Knights, along with the other groups, including a demand for action that have done so much to ensure that genocide against Christians and others could not be ignored, trivialized, or denied. The House passed House Concurrent Resolution 75, authored by my good friend and colleague Jeff Fortenberry, together with the Syrian War Crimes Tribunal resolution that I had sponsored, H. Conres 121, 3 days before the Secretary's evaluation was due. Finally, on March 17th, Secretary Kerry declared that ISIS is, and I quote, responsible for genocide against groups and areas under its control, including Yazidis, Christians, and Shia Muslims. Although the administration made the right determination, a long time coming, but they did, the question arises now what? I already have concerns that historical mistakes are being repeated. Leading up to Secretary of State Colin Powell's historic genocide determination in September of 2004, and I was very much a part of pushing for that to happen, along with others like Frank Wolf, the State Department's legal advisor had issued a memorandum that concluded that, quote, a determination that genocide has occurred in Darfur would have no immediate legal, as opposed to moral, political, or policy consequences for the United States. Secretary Kerry's legal advisors reportedly reached the same conclusion before he made his determination about ISIS. And so it again begs the question, now what? For years, the administration has been unwilling to effectively address the slaughters in Syria and Iraq. If it still thinks it has no obligation to act, it will likely continue its policy of acting too little, too late. I'm also concerned that the administration continues to conflate its strategy to combat ISIS with a strategy to protect religious minorities from genocide, war crimes, and mass atrocities. They are not the same. Combating and defeating ISIS and Islamist extremism, of course, is essential. However, there are many other elements of an effective, comprehensive civilian protection strategy, including effective monitoring and response systems, and we have yet to hear them from the administration. Civilian protection has long been missing from the administration's response to the carnage in Syria. More than half its population, an estimated 13.5 million inside Syria as of May 2016, plus another 4.8 million registered as refugees abroad, are in need of humanitarian assistance and protection. According to an April 2016 review of the casualty estimates of that conflict, the number of people who have died during Syria's civil war conflict since March 2011 range from 250,000 to 470,000. Notwithstanding the challenges of knowing exactly how many of those people were civilians and exactly how many were killed by the Assad regime and its proxies, we know this. The dictatorship has consistently, deliberately targeted civilians, hospitals, and schools with bombs and bullets and starved entire cities. While Russia, Iran, and Hezbollah have fueled the fires of death in Syria, the administration has mostly just watched Syria burn. Let me also point out that in his testimony today, and it's worth really highlighting because others will make similar points, but Carl Anderson makes the point that we are reliably informed that official government and UN aid does not reach the Christian genocide survivors in Iraq or in Syria. Repeatedly, he goes on to say, we hear from church leaders that in the region that Christians and other genocide survivors are last in line for assistance from governments. Significantly, the Archdiocese of Erbil, where most Iraqi Christians now live, receives no money from any government whatsoever. If assistance from outside church-affiliated agencies ends in Erbil, Christians there will face a catastrophic humanitarian tragedy within 30 days. The situation is similar in Syria, according to Christian leaders there, close quote. There's no easy single solution to the threats to religious and ethnic minorities and other civilians in Iraq and Syria. Obstacles clearly abound, including failures to implement the Iraq Constitution, especially to decentralize power and localize governance and security. Long-standing unresolved disputes between Iraqi Arabs and Kurds over territory and natural resources. The lack of accountability for genocide, mass atrocities, war crimes, torture, kidnappings, displacement, and more by a range of actors. The absence of an indigenously developed, internally supported national reconciliation process. Conflicts over revenue sharing, corruption, and radicalization. The list is long. Complexity must never, however, be an excuse for indifference and inaction. However, unless key issues that preceded the genocide are addressed, the genocide may be perpetuated again, and it certainly is going on right now. Over the coming weeks, I plan to introduce a comprehensive piece of legislation aimed at contributing to the safety and security of religious and ethnic minorities and civilians more broadly in Iraq and Syria. It will also address the need for accountability for genocide, mass atrocities in those conflicts, and will also, again, call for a tribunal like we saw in Sierra Leone, Rwanda, or the former Yugoslavia. And I do hope that the Senate at some point, hopefully soon, takes up our resolution that is pending before the House Foreign Relations Committee. I'd like to yield to my good friend and colleague, the ranking member, Ms. Bass.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon to the witnesses. I look forward to hearing your perspectives regarding these critical issues. As you know, on March 17, 2016, Secretary of State John Kerry declared that ISIS is responsible for genocide against groups in areas under its control, including the Yazidis, Christians, and Shia Muslims. The Secretary went on to chronicle numerous atrocities against various ethnic and religious groups by ISIL over the last few years. The question posed to the witnesses today is a logical result of the determination of genocide. Specifically, what actions need to be taken by the U.S., the international community, and frankly the region to prevent further genocide. Secretary Kerry noted in his statement on March 17th that the best response to genocide is a reaffirmation of the fundamental right to survive of every group targeted for destruction. I look forward to hearing from the witnesses today on how that can best be achieved, bearing in mind the ongoing suffering of women, men, and children who live in constant fear. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you so much. We're joined by my distinguished chairman, Dana Rohrabacher, gentleman from California.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. when we come to this issue and we look at this, yeah, it behooves us to open our hearts and try to come up with a formula that's going to help those people who are most in need and people whose lives are most in jeopardy. And unfortunately, and I'm just going to have to say, and I'm trying not to make this political, but our president has not come to the standard that I believe is adequate to deal with this horrible situation and the challenge that we face in the Middle East. I mean, it could be the guy's unable to say radical Islamic terrorism, even after our ambassador was slaughtered and murdered in Benghazi, and he hasn't been able to say those words since. And we've went on him because of that. But that mindset will have implications, and it has implications in the issues that we're talking today. We have innocent people by the hundreds of thousands, if not by the millions, who are in jeopardy of being slaughtered in the same way the Jews were slaughtered during the Holocaust. And when I look at the figures of the people who are being permitted into this country right now under this administration, the Christians, who are the basic target, the most vocalized target of these radical Muslims who are there, who are involved with this terrorist activity, the Christians are underrepresented in the number of immigrants in terms of refugees and in terms of people who are actually immigrating from those countries in which they have been targeted for genocide. This is wrong. This is absolutely wrong. It's just like sending the Jews back and saying we're going to have a more open policy because of the Nazis, but the Jews aren't going to be able to come in. I would hope that we as Americans, both Republicans, Democrats, and this administration and this Congress, recognizes we are in a moment now where we are defining ourselves. And we need to make sure that when Christians are under the threat of genocide, that they should have some priority over those other people in those countries that are not targets of genocide. And this isn't some sort of discrimination against Muslims or anybody else, or Shiites or anybody else, but let's recognize that that's what's going on, and that's what the threat is, and deal with the threat and not try to have a debate that's sanitized over here in theory. So I'm very pleased and I'm grateful to Congressman Smith, who again has demonstrated his total commitment to human rights of every person on this planet and how he commits himself to these issues. Chairman Smith, I would suggest that we again and today, we are reaffirming that we hear ISIL when they say that they're going to slaughter all the Christians. We hear them when they make proclamations of genocide against Christians, and yes, Yazidis as well, and others as well, but specifically the Christians and the Yazidis, and that we will then make sure that we mobilize, and we help mobilize the American people, which is what this hearing's all about, to save the Christians from genocide. It's up to us. I don't want future generations to look back on this generation of Americans and say they closed their ears because they had clinical analysis to do whether or not you could single out one group that's being targeted for genocide for preferential treatment in terms of immigration and refugee status. I don't want to hear that, which resulted in hundreds of thousands or maybe millions of Christians dying in the Middle East. Let's get serious about this. I appreciate this opportunity to join you, Mr. Chairman, in this very moral effort to make sure our country is practical and is courageous enough to handle this challenge, this moral challenge of our day, to save the people who are being targeted for genocide. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chairman Rohrabacher, for your very powerful statement and for your leadership on human rights. I appreciate it. We all do. I'd like to introduce our very distinguished panel. I'll begin with Mr. Carl Anderson, who is the Supreme Knight of the Knights of Columbus, where he is Chief Executive Officer and Chairman of the Board of the world's largest Catholic family fraternal service organization with over 1.9 million members. Mr. Anderson has had a distinguished career in public service and as an educator as well. From 1983 to 1997, he served in various positions in the Executive Office of the President of the United States, including Special Assistant to the President and Acting Director of the White House Office of Public Liaison. Following his service in the House, he also served for nearly a decade as a member of the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. And without objection, all of your distinguished resumes will be made a part of the record. I'll then move on to Mr. Sirhan Hamasayed, who is a Senior Program Officer for the Middle East and North Africa programs at the U.S. Institute of Peace. He joined USIP in February of 2011, works on program management, organizational development, monitoring, and evaluation. He also provides political and policy analysis on Iraq to the Institute of Peace and other peacekeeping actors. He is Deputy Director General of the Council of Ministers of the Kurdistan Regional Government of Iraq. He managed strategic government modernization initiatives through information technology with the goal of helping to improve governance and service delivery. He has also worked with the Research Triangle Institute International, Kurdistan's Save the Children, the Los Angeles Times, and other media organizations. We'll then hear from Mr. Johnny Oram, who is the Executive Director of the Chaldean Assyrian Business Alliance, dedicated to professional and social advancement of communities worldwide. He has been involved in the advocacy for the plight of the Iraqi and Syrian Christians who have been displaced due to the conflict. Additionally, Mr. Oram is involved in advocacy of the rights of the disabled, specifically those with autism spectrum disorder, or ASD. He has served in numerous capacities at the local, state, and federal levels of government, worked for the Michigan legislature, Hawaii legislature, and in the U.S. Senate. We'll then hear from Ms. Naomi Kikoler, who is the Deputy Director of the Simon Scott Center for the Prevention of Genocide at the United States Holocaust Museum. For 6 years, she developed and implemented the Global Center for the Responsibility to Protect work on populations at risk and efforts to advance R2P globally, and led the center's advocacy, including targeting the UN Security Council. She's also an adjunct professor at the New School University and an author of numerous publications. Previously, she worked on national security and refugee policy for Amnesty International Canada and in the Office of the Prosecutor of the United Nations International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda. We'll then hear from Mr. David Crane, who was appointed a professor of practice at Syracuse University of Law in December 2006. He was the founding chief prosecutor of the Special Court for Sierra Leone, an international war crimes tribunal that put many of the worst actors in that terrible, terrible tragedy behind bars. Ultimately, Charles Taylor got 50 years of prison, a sentence at The Hague, because of the great landmark work that Professor Crane did. Professor Crane's mandate was to prosecute those who bore the greatest responsibility committed during the Civil War in Sierra Leone in the 1990s. He served for more than 30 years in the federal government, has held numerous key managerial positions, and has been dogged in his work to document the atrocities that are occurring in Syria and in the region. So thank you all for being here. What you convey to us and by extension to the Congress, hopefully to the administration, will help provide us with a roadmap going forward. So, Mr. Anderson, please proceed.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for the opportunity to appear before the subcommittee today. The House of Representatives, the State Department, and the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom are all to be commended for declaring the situation confronting Christians and other religious minorities in the Middle East to be genocide. As we all know, the world's greatest humanitarian crisis since World War II is unfolding now in the Middle East. In addition to millions of refugees, many of the region's indigenous communities now face extinction. These communities may disappear in less than a decade, but their fate is not inevitable. The United States can avert this unfolding tragedy with a policy that contains, we believe, the following 6 principles. First, increase aid and ensure that it actually reaches those most in need. We are reliably informed, as the Chairman stated earlier, that official government and UN aid does not reach the Christian genocide survivors in Iraq and Syria. Repeatedly, we hear from church leaders in the region that Christians and other genocide survivors are last in line for assistance from governments. Significantly, the Archdiocese of Erbil, where most Iraqi Christians now live, receives no money from any government whatsoever. If assistance from outside church-affiliated agencies ends in Erbil, Christians there will face a catastrophic humanitarian tragedy within 30 days. And the situation is similar in Syria, according to Christian leaders there. Those who face genocide are a tiny fraction of the population. They often must avoid official refugee camps because they are targeted for violence there by extremists. As a result, these minorities often do not get official aid, and this will continue to be the reality unless specific action is taken to bring the aid to where these minorities are forced to reside by continuing violence. Knights of Columbus and other private sources have responded to this situation, but non-governmental organizations can only do so much. It is essential, therefore, that government aid is increased and that we ensure it reaches those most in need, even if special emergency appropriations are required to do this. Second, support the long-term survival in the region of these ancient indigenous religious and ethnic communities. In Iraq, the Christian population has declined by more than 80%, and in Syria it has declined by almost 70%. American policy should recognize the important differences in the situations of those fleeing violence and those targeted for genocide. And quite frankly, we should prioritize the latter. Consider this analogy. After World War II, there were approximately 50 million refugees, but only a small fraction were Jews. Yet the world understood that Jews who had survived genocide faced a qualitatively different situation and deserved heightened consideration. The same is true today for the indigenous minorities of the region. They have an indisputable right to live in their country, in whatever region of it they wish. Depending on the circumstances, this may mean that they will live where they are originally from or where they find themselves now. But as survivors of an ongoing genocide, they deserve to be prioritized in American policy-making decisions. Third, punish the perpetrators of genocide and crimes against humanity. The United States should support action by the UN Security Council to refer key perpetrators of genocide for prosecution. Equally important, we should support the Iraqi central government and the Kurdish regional government's adjudication of the cases of thousands of ISIS fighters and supporters who remain in local detention centers. This will assist in the important work of obtaining and preserving evidence of genocide. Fourth, we should assist victims of genocide in attaining refugee status. A news report as of last week indicated that of the 499 Syrian refugees admitted to the U.S. in May, not one was explicitly listed as being Christian or is coming from any of the groups targeted for genocide. We must ask, how long will this situation be allowed to continue? The U.S. should appropriate funding and work with the UN High Commissioner for Refugees to make provisions for locating and providing status to individuals such as Yazidis and Christians that have been targeted for genocide. As I mentioned earlier, many of these genocide survivors fear going into official UN refugee camps where they are targeted. Thus, they are overlooked and find it nearly impossible to acquire official refugee status or to immigrate. Congress should act now. Senator Tom Cotton has introduced the Religious Persecution Relief Act, S-2708, to provide for overlooked minorities in the prioritization of refugees. We support this bill and we urge its passage. Fifth, prepare now for the foreseeable human rights challenges as ISIS-controlled territory is liberated by ensuring that Christians and other minorities have equal rights to decide their future. And obviously this is going to happen very soon as a result of what's happening in Fallujah and Mosul. We should prepare now for the consequences of the liberation of ISIS-controlled areas. We are likely to see another humanitarian crisis as thousands of civilians flee the fighting or return to their former communities when the fighting ceases. There has been much debate concerning plans for victims of genocide in Iraq. Some have argued for returning people safely to the Nineveh region, others that they should be allowed to stay in Kurdistan, still others that they should be allowed to immigrate. But these are not necessarily ultimately exclusive competing proposals. People should be allowed to decide their own future. And when they do, we should work to ensure that they are treated with fairness, dignity, and equality. This also means that it will be increasingly important to ensure that the property rights and claims of minority groups are respected. And finally, sixth, promote the establishment of internationally agreed upon standards of human rights and religious freedom as conditions for our humanitarian and military assistance. The United States should advocate for full and equal rights for religious and ethnic minorities in the region in exchange for our military and humanitarian aid. A necessary first step to prevent genocide is to overcome the social and legal inequality that is its breeding ground. We should not accept one standard for human rights in the region and another standard for the rest of the world. The rich tapestry of religious pluralism in the region must be preserved now, or it will be lost forever. With its loss will come increasing instability and threats to our own national security and that of the world. We have a unique opportunity, and some would say a unique responsibility, to protect the victims of genocide. The United States can provide such protection with a policy that includes the principles outlined above. Mr. Chairman, we thank you very much for your leadership and that of the other members of the committee.
Mr. Anderson, thank you so very much for your comments, the very tangible support you are providing to the at-risk minorities, especially Christians, and those 6 points. They're very, very, very well thought out. I'd like to now recognize Mr. Hamasaid, and thank you for being here and for your testimony.
Mr. Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Bass, members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today. I am testifying as a senior program officer of the U.S. Institute of Peace. The views expressed here are my own and do not represent that of the Institute. USIP has worked extensively and closely with Iraqi minorities, specifically the religious minorities, and we supported them with establishing an organization called the Alliance for Iraqi Minorities so that they have the capability to represent themselves. And so in that vein, a lot of what I mentioned today is coming from experience directly engaging and trying to help those minorities. Definitely the minorities in Iraq need all the support that they can get, as well as other communities, non-minority communities in Iraq. The dilemma of the religious minorities is not something new, and I think it's important to look into some of the history so that will inform solutions that will to see if they will work and how do we prepare for those. The reality is that the minorities have, over the past few decades, have been caught in between the conflicts and the problems of actors that they were not a part of. They didn't choose those conflicts, but they were affected by those conflicts. And ISIS is not a product, and what they have done is not a product of today. ISIS is a cause of atrocity, but it also is a symptom of failure of governance and the space it has created, resulting from the political divisions among the big actors in Iraq and the region. So it is true that the minorities have suffered probably the most at the hand of ISIS, in the sense that they came under attack for displacement, for genocide, and also chemical attacks against the Turkmens in the Taza district of Kirkuk. The Yazidis have had their women and others taken as sex slaves, and we had the Christians labeled, their houses labeled, and they came under specific attacks. Then the question comes to what was the response, and the specific question that it was addressed to me to talk about is the response of the government of Iraq and the Kurdistan regional government. And to look at this, you can look at this from the perspective of a glass half full or a glass half empty. The reality is that the minorities believe that the government of Iraq and the Kurdistan regional government have not been able to protect them. And at that, they have been displaced and they have been affected. But it's also true that the Kurdistan regional government and the government of Iraq have provided camps and shelters and provide food and assistance, and they were supported by the Iraqi community, which I think it's important that they have to recognize their efforts in absorbing this crisis and the problems here. But the reality is the scope of the problem is well beyond the capacity of one single actor, one single government, or one single community, and it requires collective action. And there's a sense of fatigue for the years of displacement, especially since 2003, and the limited capacity of the government and the actors that need to be taken consideration into what the assistance provided. And I think that there is a need for rethinking the assistance that is given to the minorities and their situation. On protection, the call for protection is not something new. This has been, as you mentioned, Mr. Chairman, there has been the call by the minorities to address this for a long time. And the kind of risk that the minorities are confronted with, they are existential threats that threatens their collective well-being, and it also risks and direct risk to their security as individuals and communities. So the risk of revenge, I would like to single out. We talked about the post-return. There's a scenario of protracted displacement, which will be a scenario that we have to deal with. In the 2006-2007 peak of violence in Iraq, about 1 million people never returned home. In the current 3.3 million people that are displaced, about 1 million of them minorities, they will likely not be able to return for quite some time because of problems that are on the ground. And the revenge is killing, and the potential violence coming in those areas is a potential risk to them. The U.S. Institute of Peace has worked on models that help the return of IDPs and prevent violence. We have done this in the context of Salah ad-Din and the Spiker massacre that ISIS perpetrated against the Shia cadets and soldiers who were in that camp. We facilitated dialogue among the tribes, and we have been able to mitigate the violence and prevent killing and facilitate the return of IDPs. Tikrit right now has about 150,000 people who have returned since May of last year. The same kind of effort will be needed in the context of the minorities, because there are several layers of conflict that need to be addressed. Risk coming from existential threats like ISIL. There are risks that will come from competition over scarce resources, and there will be risks coming from just tensions of some of the minorities, considering that what happened to them by some of their Arab neighbors. So there are minority tensions that need to be addressed. There are Arab minorities issues and Kurdish that need to be addressed. So there is a need for conflict resolution to work and to help them with the long-term viability. And the minorities have the organizations and the capability to help themselves. So they have been a partner and a voice for the minorities over the years. And the Alliance of Iraqi Minorities has worked with the national government and with the Kurdistan regional government to pass legislation and make sure their issues have been prioritized. And they could continue to play that role. But at the end of the day, the scope of the need, the magnitude of the problem will require more than what has been provided to date. And I cannot emphasize enough the need for international support for early detection and acting on those warning signs that the minorities have been telling us. And it goes without saying that actually solving the bigger problems of Iraq will go a long way in helping the minorities over the long term to stay safe and not to be attacked. And while the minorities will have one will be able to develop the capabilities to provide local security, but larger existential threats coming from problems like ISIL, it will require the help and the support of the Iraqi government and the Kurdistan regional government and the larger communities around the minorities. So it's important to put emphasis on how do we rebuild those relationships, how do we put mechanisms that would prevent those kind of attacks. I think the capacity is limited, and the peaceful coexistence is the emphasis that we need to put in as a mechanism. And civil society organizations have been a good vehicle to help with the government of Iraq and the international community. They will need help in both a scenario of return, but also a scenario of protracted displacement to prevent host community tensions as well. So with that, I'll stop and thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee. I look forward to your questions.
Mr. Hamasaid, thank you very much for your testimony, which was very extensive. I've read it, and other members, I'm sure, have read it. Without objection, your and all of the distinguished witnesses' full statements and any information you'd like to attach to it will be made a part of the record, so thank you for that testimony. Mr. Orman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, members, guests. My name is Johnny Orem. I am the Executive Director of the Chaldean Assyrian Business Alliance based in Detroit, Michigan. We are an organization that is aimed at fostering professional relationships and also to enhance and the betterment of our societies globally, especially at a critical time when the existence of our peoples in our motherland, as well as in Syria, is being threatened. Before I go into recommendations for this committee, I'd like to talk briefly about our people's presence here in the United States. We, the Assyrians, Chaldeans, and the Syriacs, are the descendants of the original peoples of Abraham. We are the indigenous peoples of Iraq. We are defined by our language, which is Aramaic, the language that the Lord Jesus Christ spoke, oldest language in the world. We are also defined by our faith. We are a part of the Eastern Rite of the Roman Catholic Church in union with Rome. A good number of our Assyrians are from the Assyrian Church of the East, the Ancient Church of the East, and the Syriac Church, as well as the Presbyterian Church, Presbyterian and many other denominations. My people immigrated to the United States in the early 20th century to come to the greatest nation on the history of earth, a land where they can seek opportunities and be free to profess their faith. They came to communities such as Detroit to seek employment in our automotive plants. They came to the United States not only because of economic opportunities, but they came to the United States because the church and we had communities here that they were attracted to. When you have a church, they will come. And subsequently, there are schools, which I will elaborate here a little bit later, but that's very important to our communities, the faith and family. Oftentimes, the Assyrians and the Chaldeans are categorized as Arabs. However, we are not Arabs, but rather we are in predominantly Arab countries. Though many of our people live in Iran and Turkey, which are not Arab countries. Again, we are the indigenous peoples of the land. Nineveh was the capital of Assyria. After all, we have close to 150,000 Chaldeans and Assyrians in the metro Detroit region alone, and an additional 200,000 throughout the United States. In Chicago, Phoenix, San Diego, San Jose, Turlock, Modesto, and we also have a significant Syriac community in New York and Connecticut. My people here in the United States have a deep connection and a relationship to our persecuted refugees in Iraq and Syria. And we have welcomed thousands of them who have come to the United States with open arms. We feel for them. I'd like to touch point on the people who want to leave. So I'm going to go ahead and kind of emphasize on that here. Seeing as Christians and other minorities are particularly targeted by the Islamic State, is an imperative that they be given special consideration in the search for asylum. This is amplified by the fact that they even face persecution in asylum in shelters in Europe by radicals. Nuri Kino, a world-renowned investigative journalist and founder of the grassroots human rights organization, A Demand for Action, has been instrumental in uncovering this in Sweden and other places throughout Europe. Our people are being harassed, our people are being threatened, they're being intimidated, they're being coerced even in Europe. The opening of the new processing center in Erbil and Beirut, where the majority of Christians flee from Iraq and Syria, were a positive step. But the number of people processed must be increased to deal with the overwhelming. As far as assimilating into the United States, I think this is a perfect time to have a conversation and to talk about schools like Keys Grace Academy in Madison Heights, Michigan. I alluded to schools. This is a first of its kind in the nation, where they have engaged in Assyrian language immersion and basically preserving our identity and our culture. And the school has also helped kids adjust to and integrated into American culture while maintaining their heritage in a meaningful way. The public education system here in the United States is woefully unprepared to deal with these kids, many of them who have seen severe trauma. But schools like Keys Grace Academy, which are run by our own Chaldean and Assyrian peoples, who they understand what they've been through, are extremely critical. Furthermore, groups like the Chaldean Community Foundation in Sterling Heights, Michigan. Basically, it's a suburb of Detroit. This organization has been instrumental in helping Assyrian and Chaldean refugees to assimilate into American society. The foundation processes over 20,000 visitors annually as they help our new arrivals into the Metro Detroit region seek employment, healthcare, assistance, education, moral support, and so on. Our community in Metro Detroit is 150,000 strong and growing. As you are all aware, Mr. Chairman, members, and guests, my congressman from Michigan's 11th District, David Trott, offered an amendment to the NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act, that passed the House on May 17th, which is aimed at protecting Christians and other religious minorities throughout the Middle East, as well as throughout the Middle East from the Islamic State-led genocide by establishing a UN refugee processing center in Erbil. This requires the United Nations to step up and do its share to protecting our vulnerable communities in Iraq, as well as the United Nations. I also urge the United States Congress to reform the Refugee Act of 1980 by establishing more P2 and P3 visas for our refugees and bypassing the UN-mandated refugee allotments and quotas. Moreover, this is also going to be important for the refugees in that they can apply directly to admission to the United States of America rather than be sent off to other lands, such as various destinations in Europe and elsewhere where they have been unwelcome. Now, I'd like to elaborate on the people who want to stay. The reality is that the vast majority of people will not be able or desire to leave. So the particularly important measure will be with those that deal with the situation in Iraq and Syria. In the short term, emergency aid going directly to these organizations on the ground is extremely critical. Aid organizations like Help Iraq, the Assyrian Aid Society, ASERO, the Syriac Patriarchate, etc., have a proven ability to actually get aid to our people. Other organizations, such as my colleague Sahar Zahavi over at IsraAid, Israel's leading humanitarian organization, have been instrumental in providing aid, relief, and medical care for our refugees. The fact that our people are still being targeted in UNHCR camps by locals, not by UN staff, they almost exclusively stop going to these UN-run camps, and therefore critical aid doesn't reach them through traditional channels. Our aid organizations, in which I've alluded to earlier, fill in the void as much as possible, but resources are always in dire straits. We've seen some legislative support in the Senate Foreign Operations Appropriations, but unfortunately, the legislative support has not translated to enough material support on the ground. We must, I can't really emphasize how important that this is, but we must directly support our indigenous aid organizations on the ground. For example, our own USAID sends funds to the United Nations with the intent of distributing these funds to our communities in Iraq and Syria. The Iraqi and Syrian Christians are not receiving any of these monies. all this money goes to the UNHCR camps, a place which is unsafe for Christians and Yazidis and other religious minorities. Where is the security apparatus to protect our people in these camps, especially when they are trying to receive critical aid for their very own survival? Supporting local security forces in Iraq and Syria is the best way to ensure a stable environment where people are able to return. After the Islamic State invaded, both the Peshmerga and the Iraqi army abandoned Christian and Yazidi areas of the Nineveh Plain and Sinjar, leaving the inhabitants defenseless and deeply distrustful of the institutional security apparatus. Support authorized through the NDAA for the Assyrian, Chaldean, Syriac Christians and other minorities in Iraq and Syria is crucial in standing up to these forces. I worked with a demand for action on these efforts, and there has been some support realized for Syriac Assyrian forces in Syria, but the forces in Iraq are going to need considerable support. But it is support that they deserve and that they are entitled to, and is the only way to gain confidence of the people who have inhabited these lands for thousands of years. Finally, the creation of a safe haven with the international protection, which ultimately would be transitional to a province in the Nineveh Plains with the semblance of self-governance and self-security, is the only way to regain the trust of the minorities who feel that they were betrayed by the Iraqi government and the KRG. These issues affecting our communities in Iraq and Syria are especially addressed in House Resolution 440, a resolution introduced by Congressman David Trott and Congressman Sherman of California, which calls for precise actions that can positively affect the situation on the ground. Marking up that resolution is critical, as it would additionally serve as a moral boom to the beleaguered people, as it is the first resolution in congressional history to recognize the Semele massacre in 1933, an event where 3,000 Assyrians were massacred under the watch of the Iraqi central government. I'd like to talk on the IDP situation in Turkey. 67 years ago, right here in Washington, D.C., all the signatories to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, agreed to the following. The parties to this treaty reaffirmed their faith in the purposes and principles of the Charter of the United Nations and their desire to live in peace with all people and all governments. They are determined to safeguard the freedom, the common heritage, and the civilization of their peoples, founded on the principles of democracy, individual liberties, and the rule of law. They seek to promote stability and well-being in the North Atlantic area. They are resolved to unite their efforts for collective defense and for the preservation of peace and security. Mr. Chairman, members, being a member of NATO requires respecting peoples of all religions and all faiths. Many of our churches in Turkey are being confiscated by President Erdogan and the Council of Ministers in Turkey, under this whole guise that they're going to basically reform and revitalize those communities that have been impacted by war, especially in places like Diyarbakir. My very bishop, Francis Kalabat, in Detroit, Michigan, and many Assyrian and Chaldean clergy oftentimes have to travel to Turkey to administer to the faithful there, because our faithful basically cannot profess their faith freely. This is a NATO ally. Religious freedoms are this is basically a campaign to begin the extermination of Christianity in the Middle East. And that really doesn't bode well for us. This is an extremely vital importance to our national security and the security of the world. These include Catholics, Protestants, and Orthodox churches that date close to 2,000 years. Mr. Chairman, I would sincerely request that you and your colleagues to move forward in existing efforts in Congress to urge the Turkish government, led by President Erdogan, and his Council of Ministers to immediately return these churches to their rightful owners. This right here is an example of continued persecution and displacement of Christians in the region. Again, Turkey is supposed to be our ally, but they are not being a good actor in this situation. These actions clearly undermine the very agreement that the Turkish government signed to become a member of NATO in 1952. We, the United States of America, have a moral and fundamental obligation. We need to step up as leaders of the free world and help the thousands of Christians and other religious minorities escape displacement and death. Give them hope when they have lost hope, and to reassure them that they have a place that they can come to if they so choose, where they can be a part of a nation and contribute to our economy and our society. As I have mentioned earlier, we have the resources to absorb them. This is the right thing to do. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And God bless you and God bless America.
Thank you so much, Mr. Oram, for your testimony and recommendations and insights. I'd like to now recognize Ms. Naomi Kikoler, and thank you for being here.
Thank you, Chairman Smith and Ranking Member Bass, for holding a hearing on this important issue and for the opportunity to testify. I ask that you include in my written statement the text of the Holocaust Memorial Museum's report issued last November entitled, "Our Generation is Gone: The Islamic State's Targeting of Iraqi Minorities in Nineveh." Last month, I was sitting with a Yazidi woman in a displaced persons camp outside of Duhok in the Kurdistan region of Iraq. She was kidnapped by Islamic State fighters in the village of Kocho during an attack where hundreds of Yazidi men were killed. When I met her, she, along with her 2 young children, had escaped her Islamic State captor in Syria only 2 weeks earlier. She had been forcibly converted to Islam, and for almost 2 years, she was held as a sex slave. She and her children are the face of a modern-day genocide that is being perpetrated by the Islamic State. For those still being held today, that genocide is ongoing. The administration's determination that this self-proclaimed Islamic State committed genocide and crimes against humanity against religious minorities is an important recognition of the heinous crimes committed by the Islamic State and the suffering of victims like the woman I met and her children. However, if the label of genocide is truly to have meaning for the victims of that crime, then this discussion should evolve from a question of what happened to how to protect vulnerable communities using military and non-military tools from future threats by the Islamic State and other extremist groups. This includes how to secure justice and accountability for the victims of their crimes. Genocide is a rare occurrence. There is no blueprint for how the United States government responds in situations where genocide has been committed or is taking place. With this in mind, we at the Simon Skjodt Center for the Prevention of Genocide traveled last month to the Kurdistan region of Iraq and to newly liberated areas by Mount Sinjar to assess what needs to be done to protect vulnerable minorities as a follow-up to the report we released in November 2015, documenting the commission of genocide, crimes against humanity, and ethnic cleansing committed by the Islamic State against minorities. Our trip starkly revealed that these communities remain at risk of future atrocities. Those who stay in exile in the Kurdistan region of Iraq are physically safe, yet they yearn to return home. As long as the Islamic State exists, these communities will remain vulnerable. The Islamic State still occupies large swaths of land in Nineveh, making it impossible for minority communities to return home. Certain liberated areas are also too dangerous for civilians to return home, as they are within the range of ISIS mortar fire. This is particularly true for communities on the south side of Mount Sinjar and those close to Mosul. Defeating the Islamic State, therefore, should remain a key priority of the U.S. government's efforts, if our hope is to ensure the very survival of these communities. Yet to animate this objective, civilian protection and the prevention of atrocities should be at the core of that strategy. We know from past cases that this requires a comprehensive and sustained strategy using military and non-military tools that is calibrated to respond to evolving conditions on the ground to prevent genocide and other mass atrocities. In this context, a strategy would include day-after planning to identify scenarios and tools that would mitigate potential future flashpoints and implement strategies to address them, including rebuilding liberated areas, promoting reconciliation between groups, advancing justice and accountability efforts, and securing a political resolution between the government of Iraq and the Kurdish regional government to the disputed areas in which many of Iraq's minorities live. The most common sentiment that we heard from displaced minority communities, and one that needs to be addressed, is their lack of trust in the officials and institutions that are responsible for their physical protection and for guaranteeing their legal rights, as well as their deep distrust of their former Sunni Arab neighbors who they perceive as having been complicit in ISIS's attacks. Religious minorities continue to feel that the Iraqi security forces and the Kurdish Peshmerga abandoned them when the Islamic State attacked Nineveh. Many also continue to feel that they are being used as political pawns by the government of Iraq and the Kurdish regional government in the ongoing contest over the disputed area. This leaves them nervous about who and how their land will be administered should they return home. For over 10 years, religious minorities were targeted on the basis of their identity by extremist groups and were politically marginalized. The early warning of their vulnerabilities went largely unheeded, and as a result, many saw fleeing the country as their only protection option. Today, in the absence of what they again see as being credible actors to provide their physical protection, many communities are seeking to arm themselves. New threats are also emerging for not just religious minorities, but also for the Sunni Arab population, who may be the victims of revenge killings. The proliferation of unregulated and poorly trained militias may pose additional threats to civilians in areas liberated from the Islamic State as they seek to liberate additional territory. Many that we interviewed expressed concerns about the potential for conflict between militias within particular religious communities and amongst religious groups. This all underscores that defeating the Islamic State and protecting vulnerable communities requires more than just a military strategy if civilians are to be protected. It requires tackling the root causes that allowed the Islamic State to rise and that enhance the vulnerabilities of minority communities. In light of this, we believe that there are 4 principal areas where additional effort could be paid to ensure both the immediate protection needs of vulnerable communities seeking to return home and the long-term and systematic drivers, ensure that the long-term and systematic drivers of conflict are mitigated. Those are, first, an explicit policy to provide genuine physical protection to vulnerable populations. Protection could include strategies for employing local, domestic, and international actors to provide security to ethnic and religious minorities returning to liberated lands and Sunni Arab populations at risk of reprisal killings. In planning military operations and broader policy objectives, actors should consider the possible unintended consequences of the actions taken and whether they will heighten risk for civilian populations living under the Islamic State's control and/or might contribute to future cycles of violence. The Iraqi government and international donors should ensure that all Iraqi security forces, Iraqi Kurdish Peshmerga, and local militias fully adhere to international human rights and humanitarian law standards and are held accountable for violations in accordance with international standards. Withholding military assistance to those groups who do not adhere to these standards could be a powerful tool in addressing the behavior of bad actors. Second is support for stabilization and reconstruction efforts in liberated areas. This includes increasing the presence of development assistance from relevant agencies and departments. Many of the displaced expressed concerns to us that they will be unable to return home in the absence of economic opportunity and the reconstruction of their devastated regions. High rates of unemployment within the Sunni population and perceived economic inequity was one of the drivers of the rise of the Islamic State. Affected regions must be rebuilt, and the engagement of the international community must be sustained in that endeavor in the years to come. A critical component of stabilization and reconstruction efforts is investing in reconciliation so that diverse communities can once again live alongside each other. In the absence of such efforts, there's a grave potential for future conflict between communities. Third, transitional justice efforts are central to responding to the commission of past crimes and the deterrence of future crimes. The clearest obligation in the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide is to punish the perpetrators of genocide, and international justice is a cornerstone upon which the international community has responded to the crime of genocide, from Nuremberg 70 years ago to the International Criminal Tribunals for Rwanda, Yugoslavia, and Cambodia. Today, substantial support is needed to investigate, collect, and analyze evidence, secure mass grave sites, and detain perpetrators for the purpose of future prosecutions. In this effort, we can't lose sight of the importance of holding individuals accountable for crimes committed at the local level. The most common answer to the question of how can trust be built between minorities and the Sunni Arab population that we posed to people who were displaced was that those who committed crimes in their towns and villages needed to be held accountable in a court. The rampant culture of impunity has left high levels of distrust amongst ordinary Iraqis. They need to see justice advanced, not only against the Islamic State's leaders for genocide, but also for the crimes committed by their neighbors in their very own communities. This necessitates detaining fighters, investigating their crimes, and then prosecuting them at the national as well as possibly the international level. Fourth is securing the political resolution to the ongoing dispute between the Kurdish regional government and the Iraqi central government over Nineveh. Our report was very clear in identifying the ongoing dispute as a key factor that exacerbated the vulnerability of minority communities, in part because the dispute is perceived as having contributed to growing support for extremist groups, and when the Islamic State advanced, there were no clear lines of responsibility. As long as responsibility for protecting these communities remains in question, vulnerabilities will remain acute and create a vacuum that the Islamic State or a successor group could exploit. Finally, to recognize that genocide has happened is to acknowledge a collective failure to prevent the crime of all crimes and to uphold the commitment to never again. Going forward, the U.S. and other governments will need to place civilian protection and the prevention of atrocities at the core of their counter-ISIL strategies. But the commitment to prevent and protect minorities must extend beyond the current threat posed by the Islamic State. We must endeavor to ensure that in 10 years, we are not yet again meeting in the wake of another failure to protect vulnerable minorities in Iraq and Syria. Countering the Islamic State and preventing future atrocities perpetrated by other groups necessitates an ongoing assessment of those groups' motivations, organization, and capabilities for committing atrocity crimes, and of the vulnerabilities of at-risk communities. Continuous monitoring and analysis of the warning signs and risk indicators on the ground will be needed, and strategies developed to ensure that threats facing minorities in the future are mitigated. That is what upholding the commitment to prevent, enshrined in the Genocide Convention, should mean. Thank you.
Thank you so very much for your testimony and for reminding us of what the face of genocide is with your experience with the young woman and her 2 children. As you pointed out, she was forcibly converted to Islam. For almost 2 years, she was held as a sex slave. That is just numbing in how awful and horrific that reality has been. So thankfully you were there, and now you have conveyed that message to all of us, and that should be fresh impetus for all of us to do even more. I'd like to now yield to Mr. Crane, former Chief Prosecutor of the Special Court of Sierra Leone.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the subcommittee, its staff, and in particular its chairman for its decades-long fight against the atrocities committed by state and non-state actors around the world. In fact, you and I have been working together since 2002, along with many members of this committee, in seeking justice for the oppressed. We are in an age of extremes, with adversaries never contemplated facing challenges that are most likely not solvable. The 21st century is shaping up to be no better than what I call the bloody 20th century, where over 225 million people died of non-natural causes, over 100 million of which that I estimate at the hands of their own governments. In the 21st century, conflict will be kaleidoscopic and dirty, with one or all sides ignoring international law. Our current planning in the United States and preparation cycle make us incapable of dealing with these kaleidoscopic conflicts and events. And I'm working with the International Peace and Security Institute to quantify that data. Despite this, we have seen the evolution of modern international criminal law, which has now given us the practical and legal capability of holding dictators, thugs, and their henchmen accountable for atrocity, if there is a political will to do so. I underscore, if there is a political will to do so. If we do have that political will, We have the experience now to prosecute those who feed on their own peoples. Now, we have mentioned many numbers this afternoon related to casualties, 300,000 persons killed, over 10 million refugees moving about the region with no hope and no homes. But I do want to underscore that these are about human beings, individual human beings. When I was in Sierra Leone, I would hold town hall meetings, and I was in McKinney, the headquarters of the infamous Revolutionary United Front, who cut hands off of victims and other body parts. And as I was holding this town hall meeting, a young child soldier stood up. He was about 12, and he looked at me in the eye, and he began to weep, and he said, "I killed people. I'm sorry. I didn't mean it." And as I was holding him in my arms as he wept, a young woman stood up 10 feet from me. Most of her face was missing because it had been put in a pot of boiling water. She was holding her child, and she, through cracked lips, said, "Seek justice." That's why we do this. And that's why I want to underscore in my remarks today that we don't forget that it's as individual human beings, one person at a time. There's been a complete breakdown of the rule of law and accountability in the Levant. The laws of armed conflict are ignored, resulting in mounting civilian casualties. There is an increased use of banned weapon systems, such as barrel bombs and chemical weapons, along with the increase in various torture and execution methods not seen since the Dark Ages. The Caesar report, which I co-authored and which we testified a year or so ago, found direct and clear and convincing evidence of this horror. In the Levant region, there are 3 international crimes that are being committed. They have been highlighted in this testimony and are well known by this committee. War crimes, crimes against humanity, and possibly genocide. I want to underscore and caution that we have to be very careful that politicians and diplomats tend to rank or tier international crimes, and holding out genocide as the top tier. Well, I would just submit respectfully to this committee that 300,000 people killed as a result of an international crime don't care whether it's a genocide, crime against humanity, or war crime. So I want to caution our use of terms. They are important, but they are crimes. And I also want to point out of these 3 crimes, one is a specific intent crime, which means that you have to have a specific intent to destroy in whole or in part a people's. It's a difficult crime to prove, and in some cases you almost need a smoking gun. So I would just caution this committee, when they're considering the war crimes, watch out for tiering and ranking the crimes, as well as understanding that genocide, even though a very serious crime indeed, a crime of crimes, is a difficult and very specific type of crime, which at the legal level has to be clearly and beyond a reasonable doubt proven, each and every element. So what is next then? You ask me that question. First, there must be a realization that the ISIS phenomenon is a decades-long challenge. We are entering into an effort that is of Cold War ramifications. At this time, we do not have a solution for this challenge. Until we do have a realistic and practical solution, we must understand that we may not be able to restore international peace and security, only manage some sense of security in the Levant. The conflict there truly is kaleidoscopic in nature, where if one thing changes, everything changes. We cannot predict or plan what happens next. The cornerstone to a possible beginning of a solution is Arab resolve and cooperation. However, this may not be possible given political realities. The West cannot be seen as an interloper, only as a patient enabler and a facilitator. We can't be seen as launching the seventh crusade, so to speak. Over the next several years, we must contain the ISIS threat regionally, stamp out ISIS attempts to further their cause elsewhere, and focus on achievable programs in the region, locally, and domestically. And I would underscore some of the important points made by my colleagues this afternoon. I just would like to say a young man or woman who has a job and some hope for a better future is less likely to turn to terror and to ISIS. Essentially what I'm saying is that we cannot defeat ISIS using kinetic energy alone. In reality, it can only be done through economic revitalization, almost a Marshall Plan for the Middle East. It's that kind of commitment. Additionally, we can take realistic steps to start an accountability mechanism for the region, particularly as it relates to ISIS atrocity. If we have the political will, we can establish some tried and true methods. We should start with the Truth Commission, not a Reconciliation Commission at this point, but start with the Truth Commission. Let's get something started. Let's get something going. We also have the ability and the experience to set up a domestic court or an internationalized domestic court, even a hybrid regional court, which we did in the Special Court for Sierra Leone. The International Criminal Court, though an important and permanent entity, is politically, unfortunately, neutralized by the United Nations Security Council and, unfortunately, will not play a major part in this effort, even though we need to recognize that they do have a potential place. The practical reality is a domestic court, an internationalized domestic court, or a hybrid regional court supported by regional countries, or countries in the region, is the more practical and realistic opportunity. Now, these mechanisms can be headquartered in Iraq, Turkey, or Jordan, supported by members of the Arab League. The international community could assist and train commission or court personnel as requested and needed. The ideal is having Arab states prosecuting Arabs for crimes against Arab peoples in violation of Arab laws. Now, we've done this before with the Special Court for Sierra Leone. We have moved into an area, worked with peoples, developed methodologies, efficiently managed justice mechanisms, and brought accountability to millions of victims there in West Africa. We've translated this success into the Syrian Accountability Project, where we have built a conflict map, a crime-based matrix, sample indictments, so that someday when a domestic, regional, or international prosecutor is designated, we can hand this package over to them for their consideration to get things started. So what are my conclusions? The Levant is an unmanageable space. International peace and security cannot be restored using today's outmoded problem-solving techniques. Thus, there are no foreseeable political or military solutions. This is a multifaceted and I underscore decades-long struggle. It is truly kaleidoscopic. Our next steps should be to continue to try and contain ISIS. On the periphery, create achievable regional and domestic programs, and I would humbly suggest perhaps that Marshall Plan. Let's take away the reason for ISIS to be. No hope in the future. Let's take away the reason for ISIS to be. No hope in the future. We have and can offer better alternatives, such as freedom and a jobs plan, possibly. You know, it is within the realm of possibility to develop a justice mechanism outside the UN Security Council. The focus should be using regional and domestic arrangements to create those mechanisms. We must not be discouraged. We must be patient and firm in our resolve for accountability, stability, and peace. A little over 10 years ago, President Charles Taylor never thought that he would be held accountable for his crimes in West Africa. But today, he sits in a maximum security prison in Great Britain for the rest of his life, paying the price for aiding and abetting the murder, rape, maiming, and mutilation of over 1.2 million human beings. We can hold ISIS accountable for their crimes and begin to establish some sense of peace in the Levant. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for this time. I stand ready to answer any questions.
Thank you, Professor Crane, for your testimony, for your leadership. And one of the pictures that I will never forget is the picture that was all on the front pages, or page 3 of most of the newspapers around the world, of Charles Taylor receiving a 50-year prison sentence, eyes cast down, thinking, I'm sure, that he would never be held to account for the atrocities he committed on the Liberian and the people of Sierra Leone and the region. So thank you for that successful, and the other men who committed such horrific acts of violence against innocent people, especially women and children, for that, and for your recommendations. They're outstanding. Just a few questions to start off. I'll yield to my colleague, and then we'll have perhaps a few more additional questions. Mr. Anderson, you make a very strong point. Mr. Orem, you do it as well, that the aid that is meant to go to, or what many people think would get to Christians, is not getting through, and to other persecuted minorities like Yazidis. And the importance of backing indigenous efforts, particularly the churches, to get that aid through. I mean, we had a hearing last, I chaired it with Assistant Secretary Ann Richard under the auspices of the Helsinki Commission on why, it's kind of like two-part question here, why so many people went to flight and left and made their way into Europe. One was that there was gross underfunding of the international calls for subsistence. Mr. Hamasaid, you made the point as well that efforts continue to fall woefully short of the needs for food, shelter, healthcare, education, psychosocial support for those to deal with trauma in your testimony. And the number that we got was about 40% of the requests of the competent authorities like the UNHCR. That's all they got. And this year so far, we're at, for 2016, 23% funded, although we're not done 2016. 40%, 42% is, as you said, woefully underfunding. One of the biggest takeaways from that hearing came from the UNHCR representative who said the reason why people left, one was a loss of hope. Secondly, a cut in the World Food Program of about 30%. And they said, that's it. They don't have our back. We're going to stagnate here, maybe even die. We're going to head to Europe or Germany or somewhere else where the pastures might be greener. So the international community fatally, I think, underfunded those efforts. The U.S. led the effort. Perhaps we should have done more or mobilized more. This isn't a hearing to point fingers. It's to say we've got to get it right. And my hope is we will do a second hearing. Just so you know, Ms. Bass and I, we've already asked Rabbi Saperstein, the top point person for religious freedom. He couldn't come today, but he sends his regrets. He will make an appearance. We'll also ask Ann Richards, Assistant Secretary at PRM, and others, because I do think, you know, there's a place where we need to be joined at the hip, congressional and executive branch, to make a difference in the lives of these people. But the gross underfunding, and if you would elaborate a little bit on this 30-day window, Mr. Anderson, you talked about that if people don't get food and medicines, and any of you who would like to touch on this, they are literally at the point of starvation and obviously other terrible consequences from malnutrition.
Well, I would say, Mr. Chairman, most of what we hear is anecdotal. Just this week, my assistant is in Erbil. I was speaking with him this morning, and he was calling me from an Yazidi camp. He told me that what he had been told was that the Yazidis in this camp had received one food drop from the UN when they arrived, and since that time, all of their assistance has come through the Archdiocese of Erbil. For example, all of their medical assistance comes through the medical clinic that we have been funding. So if those sources stop, you can see here's a community, they're still living in tents, there's nothing available for them. So I would think maybe you have the same kind of evidence that you're receiving, but we hear this from the religious leaders in Erbil, and we hear it from the religious leaders in, say, Aleppo and throughout Syria. It's the same issue.
Yes, Mr. Orman, and then Mr. Hamasaid.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Mr. Anderson, thank you. Yes, that is a common narrative in Erbil for our people. So as I had mentioned in testimony, Mr. Chairman, organizations like Help Iraq, Syrian Aid Society, ASERO, and others are basically doing the job of what governments and governmental agencies should be doing. And a lot of our people, you know, a lot of this assistance goes to the UN-run camps, but a lot of our Christians and other religious minorities are afraid to go to those camps because so one recommendation is to really, in addition to the Refugee Processing Center, we don't know, I know that there's been legislation to call for that, and also to form some other venue for them to go and receive aid. So there needs to be a security apparatus in place, especially even at the UN camps, because a bulk of that aid goes to those camps.
And you know, when I raised it with the UNHCR, as I did at that hearing, and I've done ever since and before, they're very defensive, and I understand where they're coming from. It's not them; it's the people in the camp,
Right.
and those who wish them ill. They being the Christians or the Yazidis or the other minorities.
That is correct. You're absolutely right, and it's.
But that doesn't mean they don't have a responsibility, and all of us, to get the money, the food, humanitarian assistance to those who are suffering.
And that's why it's so extremely critical in the Senate Foreign Operations Appropriations mechanism to increase aid for these international non-governmental organizations, because they are preparing. So what oftentimes has to happen is communities like organizations like Help Iraq are vested with the responsibility of engaging in fundraising campaigns throughout the world. In Detroit, we've raised hundreds of thousands of dollars from our community, and all that money, and clothing, drivers for clothing and food and blankets, especially in the wintertime. That's also a critical time. But our communities in northern Iraq, the Assyrians and the Chaldeans, they're basically prisoners in their own country. And the other, the other important issue is, and Mr. Anderson, the Assyrians, they can't seek Chaldeans can't be gainfully employed in Kurdistan. Now, we have a problem with that.
Yeah.
You can't seek employment. Kurdistan, as far as I understand, is still a part of Iraq. Our people are basically depending on the diaspora communities for their survival. So the United Nations, and in fact, I've had conversations with folks from the United Nations, and they basically said that, when it came to the issue pertaining to the security of Nineveh and the communities in Syria and what have you, Qamishli and what have you, they basically said that they don't have the resources, or they are not in a position to provide UN peacekeeping forces to protect those communities that are being threatened. So really, the United Nations really needs to step up to the plate, and be a leader and providing a security apparatus. And also, when I like to also allude to to jump into the refugee issue. Yes, we have, as far as refugee admission to the United States, the Christians have really been less than 1% of admissions into this country. I mean, I'm not here to have a debate about religion and about Islam and Christianity, but it seems 99% of the refugees that have been admitted to the United States are Muslim. And when the United States basically was debating as to whether or not to declare this a genocide, their whole concern was, well, the Christians, they have options. They can pay a jizya, a fee, basically to stay alive. And basically, they think that it took a year and a half for Secretary Kerry to make this declaration. And basically, but all experts throughout the world came to the understanding and conclusion that this was actually a genocide. And I do commend the Secretary for finally making that declaration. So yeah, we need to really step up to the plate and provide financial assistance to these organizations, and so the money can get to the communities.
Yes.
Yeah. If I may just stress that the point I made in the written testimony as well, which the need today, whatever is seen by the international community, is far greater than what the system captures, because the system does not see the amount, the volume of assistance that came from the local communities, from the Iraqis, whether in the Kurdistan region or the rest of the country. They have helped a lot in shouldering this burden. Actually, they were the first responders, in a way, to the wave of crisis. But I think in addition to seeing the current need, we have to also have a forward-looking about what will be the magnitude of the problem in a scenario of a protracted displacement a year from now, 2 years from now. a good number of those people will stay with us. And the kind of tensions that we see today in the host communities, in the IDP camps, and a good number of people are outside the IDP camps, sometimes not registered in the system because of lack of documentations, or the bureaucracy does not have the capacity to handle this magnitude. The Iraqis, neither the Kurdistan Regional Government nor the Iraqi government have handled something like this from a bureaucracy and system standpoint. They don't have the capacity. Then there is the issue of resources. The communities have exhausted their resources that they had because of the economic downturn in Iraq. The drop in oil prices has strained the system. The country is going through, is fighting ISIL, so there's the military expenses. You have the destruction that comes from this fight. Fallujah, Ramadi, 80% destruction. Other towns, the pictures are horrible. Sinjar, the other areas of the minority places, the potential for return is a significant problem. So the tensions will be something that we need to focus on. And it is important as we do this. There are issues that are directed as minorities from ISIL and other groups, but there are, some of this is just a natural product of the chaos and the conflict where people do not have income and resources, they don't have jobs. There is a pressure on the governments of the region in Iraq or elsewhere to provide economic opportunities and give job permits. But the economy being down and people not having jobs is not just, you can go outside the camp, but there are no jobs. There are many, many IDPs who have been interviewed and they say, the economy outside, there's nobody to hire us because the economy is down. Oil prices is down. And the Kurdistan Regional Government and its tensions with Baghdad, they are late 3 months in the payment of their public servants. Their resources to help with the IDPs is far more limited. So therefore, the international community really takes this seriously from a humanitarian standpoint, but also from a conflict prevention standpoint, because the more displaced, the more no resources, so they either have to migrate or they will be vulnerable for other forms of radicalization as a response to the problem that they face.
Thank you for raising that question, and maybe just to pick up on some of the things that Sarhang mentioned. I think it's really important to underscore that the implications of the underfunding means that this crucial conversation about the day after, and in reality, we're talking about today. For areas that are already liberated around Sinjar, this is a question that people are grappling with today. Do people return? Can they return? Who's taking the leadership in pushing that conversation? That discussion about the day after should be a central component of our counter-ISIL strategy conversations right now. All of us have highlighted a couple of components that usually fall outside, as Sarhang mentioned, of the traditional discussion of conflict prevention or counterterrorism. That's reconciliation, reconstruction, addressing political grievances, and the importance of accountability. Each of those require resources dedicated towards them, yet they are simply not a priority right now for many of the actors that we hope to take a leadership role on these particular issues.
If you could just elaborate, not a priority for whom? The U.S. government, the governments in the region?
I think it'd be fair to say the international community as a whole has not been focused on this day after conversation. And I think there's an important role that Congress and others can play in raising that particular issue. When we went to areas that have been newly liberated, to highlight what Sarhang mentioned, you see town after town and village after village that has been simply devastated. Homes that have been bombed, every gas station has been destroyed, water is down, electricity is beginning to be back in order. People are waiting to return home because they are waiting to see the schools in the Kurdish Regional Government close, waiting to see schools open now in newly liberated areas. Those are the types of urgent needs that need to be addressed and need to be part of that counter-ISIL strategy. I think just maybe to kind of underscore a point that was made before too, those are not traditional kind of kinetic issues that need to be prioritized from an atrocity prevention perspective. And it means that they're being viewed as second-order priorities, whereas really they should be first-order priorities if we're hoping to prevent a recurrence of these crimes. And we need to do that with the recognition, as Sarhang said, that the capacity of the government of Iraq and the capacity of the Kurdish Regional Government to address these issues is really quite diminished. And there's also concerns about the political will to address some of these particular concerns.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to, as I'm sitting here thinking of time and how long this conflict has gone on, I recall back in March of 2011, I was asked by the Syrian National Congress at the time to meet with me in The Hague to talk about justice mechanisms that we could implement in the spring of 2011. It was a time of hope and excitement. It was the Free Syrian Army versus the Assad regime. It was not that completely simple, but that was pretty much it. They were enthusiastic, they were listening, and I've been working with that group along with the International Criminal Court, the United Nations, and other countries in dealing with a transitional justice process. But dealing with my Syrian colleagues, I've noticed a sadness in their eyes, and they realize that this isn't going to go well, and I agree with them. I particularly noticed after the summer of 2013 when a certain line was drawn in the sand saying, if you do this, then the international community will step in. It happened, and nothing happened. And as we have been collating and putting in the crime-based matrix events that have taken place that possibly could be war crimes, crimes against humanity, what have you, there was a pause in that summer of 2013 when the threat was made that if you do this, then we're going to step in. We actually saw, anecdotally, a decrease in atrocities. As soon as that line was drawn and was stepped over, then all hell broke loose. And we saw an increase in atrocities, which have gone off the chart since that time. Our crime-based matrix at the Syrian Accountability Project is now over 7,000 pages of incidents that have taken place that could amount to international crime. So I just want to underscore, when we're talking about the urgency of time, we have now moved into an era where there is no practical solution to the Levant.
I have some additional questions, which I'll hold for a few moments, but I'd like to yield to my good friend and colleague, Ms. Bass, Ranking Member.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate you giving me the opportunity. First of all, I would really like to thank all of the witnesses for not just your testimony, but the work that you do. It's really been sobering. I wanted to ask a couple of questions of you, Mr. Aran, about the Assyrian population in the U.S. You mentioned the Michigan area, and I was wondering, are there other places around the U.S. where there is a population? And the other thing you mentioned was the population in Europe is experiencing some problems. It sounded like it was internal to the community, but I wonder if those same type of problems are being manifested in the United States.
Thank you very much, Ms. Bass. We have in the Metro Detroit region, close to 200,000 Assyrians. We have been in the United States for decades. We, in addition to Detroit, there's a significant population. There's about 70,000 Assyrians in Chicago alone. And then we have communities in San Diego, Phoenix, the Central Valley of California, the Modesto-Turlock area. So yeah, we have a considerable population of our communities. And as far as, and I'll go to your question on Europe, but as far as the problems here, no, when the refugees immigrate to the United States, like specifically in Detroit in particular, we have a community in Detroit that is so strong and well-rooted, groundedly rooted in the community. People in the community know who the Chaldeans and the Syrians are. But you'll have your occasional, individuals that will basically categorize the Assyrians and the Chaldeans as being Arabs and Muslims and we're terrorists and what have you. But see, a lot of it is also about education. We go around to communities and we educate policymakers all throughout the country and business leaders about who we are, what our identity is and our faith. And so that's extremely important. But no, our communities don't face violence here in the United States. This is the land of the free. This is the greatest country in the history of Earth. And as far as Europe is concerned, yes, what's happening is a lot of the refugees are being grouped up, and it's not the governments that are really, conducting this. It's basically the populace in some of these countries. You've got a lot. Europe's borders are very porous.
Right.
And so what's happening is, we have our refugees that are in Sweden. We have and all throughout Europe, as Nuri Kino, the investigative journalist and the founder of A Demand for Action, has spent 30 years documenting the issues of refugees and migration and what have you. And so there are communities, and there are in Europe where they face violence because of their faith.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate that.
Sure.
And then, Mr. Crane, I really admire what you've done in the past, and Mr. Smith shared with me a few minutes ago about how you faced daily death threats during the time of Sierra Leone. And to come through that, you come through it with a certain amount of soberness. I didn't particularly like to hear what you said, but I appreciate the reality. When you said that, one, you characterized it as Cold War ramifications, and I think you meant by that this is nothing that's going to be solved quickly. But I appreciate you saying that, because there's so much rhetoric out there about why don't we just do this and it fixes it. And I think, you painted a far more realistic picture, and I appreciate that, even though it was difficult to hear. So I wanted to know if you would elaborate a little more about some of the solutions that you talked about. You talked about a Marshall Plan. I was wondering what your vision would be as to who would come together to do that. You talked about holding ISIS accountable, and you mentioned a hybrid court, and I wanted to understand what exactly that meant, how that would be. What you went through in Sierra Leone, trying to imagine holding ISIS accountable like that when the leadership is so diffuse. How would you hold ISIS accountable? What are some of your thoughts about that? Well, why don't we start? Why don't we start there?
Thank you, Ms. Bass. I appreciate your comments, and I think your questions are very, very important. What I really wanted to underscore in my comments this afternoon is that this truly is a decades-long effort in this age where we try to solve problems within 24 hours. It just can't be done. After World War II, in facing the Cold War and the challenge of the Soviet Union, the world got together and created the political will to face down the Iron Curtain and what was behind it. We created NATO. We moved into Korea. We're still in Korea.
Mm-hmm. Right.
1950. Mm-hmm. NATO is a successful example of a commitment by the world to stop tyranny. So there is historical precedent, if there's the political will, to come in and begin a process where we have the international community administered probably by the region, where we have the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, others where we have funds where we, instead of spend billions of dollars a week bombing what we perceive to be a threat, and creating job programs. I mean, what a wonderful thing is to see almost like a civilian conservation corps out there creating roads and building and reconstructing the damage that has been done. Again, I know it's not that simple, but at least if we change and shift our emphasis on construction as opposed to destruction, I think that we have a better chance in succeeding. So that was what I meant by the Marshall Plan.
Let me interrupt you for just a minute about that, okay? One, I would love to see that actually here with our infrastructure, our failing infrastructure and need for jobs. But this is what confuses me, and that is, who would the actors be? Because post-World War II, I mean, and most of what you described in terms of the International Monetary Fund, World Bank, et cetera, are European-based. You know what I mean? And what parts of the region come together, considering, whether they're actively involved or not? how would you have the European-based powers then go in and say, here's a Marshall Plan for what is predominantly the Arab world?
Well, again, an excellent question, and probably an unanswerable question as far as political will. We just have to step back and stop using kinetic energy to solve the problems in the Middle East. It's not working, and yet we take all those billions, and in some cases now probably trillions of
right.
dollars, and we could have shifted that in a way that would have revitalized an area, not making it a religious base, not making it
Right.
Sunni versus Shia or Christian versus Muslim, an ability for the region, backed by Arab states as well, with some leadership by the European Union, what have you, to do this. It's not going to be easy, but I'm just trying to get a conversation going and asking the question, can we do better than just kinetic energy, bombing our way out of a solution?
I appreciate that.
And so again, forgive me for not being able to give you specific answers.
It's okay.
Because I don't, but I think that changing our perspective will certainly be important. Now, you also bring up the hybrid court idea. At the end of the day, this is all about the victims. All right, we're very arrogant about how we approach international justice. You know, we don't have all the solutions. There are certainly other justice methodologies. I always used to ask the question, is the justice we seek the justice they want? I think that's really an important question, because we tend to think that the European model of international justice or the common law model is the model. But some of these justice mechanisms in other parts of the world have been around for thousands of years and have worked. So we have to be very, very humble to realize what do the victims in Syria and in the Levant and in the northern Iraq, what is justice to them? And once we begin to consider that, there are many, many possibilities, and it may not be an international system. So a hybrid court or a domestic court or an internationalized domestic court may be something that may be important. Even going back and looking at tribal and cultural type of methods of justice may be a start or a beginning. How would you hold members of ISIS accountable? Well, of course, that is a challenge. I think that once we were able to do that, that's part and parcel to this overall A plus B plus C plus D step forward, is begin to try to contain ISIS. A good example is ISIS is like a cancer that is not going to cause a fatal result, but it's there. And so your doctor is going to have to say, we're going to have to manage this. And so we should manage ISIS like such, try to cut out areas that they try to grow in other parts of the world, Libya, for example, and other parts. Deal with those smaller problems, but try to contain ISIS, and then begin to develop many things, to include a justice mechanism where it can be seen that the international community, the region itself, is actually doing something. It doesn't have to be elaborate. It can be just a simple step of creating a truth commission where we have the truth being garnered. Again, if you build it, they will come. You know, I've been told, well, you can't have a truth commission for these various reasons, what have you. Well, we've got to do something. We've got to be seen to doing something in the transitional justice area other than talking about various ways that we can go about that. That's just a simple example. But this is all part and parcel to a larger achievable results. Contain ISIS and begin to pick out areas where we can succeed so we can bring back that hope, which robs ISIS of its ability to recruit, and that cancer begins to shrink. Now again, there's many, many levels of problems here that could throw this off the rails, but we just have to look at this a little bit more simply and a little bit more objectively and step back and go, what really is working and what really isn't working, and I'll guarantee you it's not using kinetic energy.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yes, ma'am.
Yield back.
Just quickly on the question of justice, I mean, this is something that we have, working with the Institute of Peace and dealing with actually areas that have been liberated, because we have the experience that we are looking at about, okay, what does that look like? And this is closer to Salah ad-Din and not directly minority areas. But the issue of justice, where you have tribes, they have their local mechanisms that usually they go for revenge, and there is exacting blood money, and these have complicated the situation. In the case of in Tikrit, after what's known as Camp Spiker, where ISIL killed 1,700 soldiers and cadets, we managed to tap into those local traditions through facilitated dialogue, facilitators USIP trained over the years, and we've managed to, there's a level of venting that needs to take place among those actors. That happened, and then they engage on the substance. They realize that going into this cycle of violence will change the nature of the problem, and it will make things more complex. So there are ways that you can deal with this and tap into those local solutions and prevent violence. There was a question of justice. So for those who have been killed, for those who have been displaced, what does justice look like? And there is no answer, there is no universal answer. It really varies what the different communities accept. In Tikrit, they decided that they will work with the judicial system of the government. The tribe said, we will work with the system and we'll bring perpetrators to justice and we'll work with you. In the town a few miles away, in Yathrib, Salah ad-Din, the local population to date are not allowing people to return because they do not necessarily accept that other local solution. So, and the government does not have the capacity to deal with the justice of ISIL because, as you alluded to, these are fragmented members. It's not an entity that you can go to one place and capture them. And unless the local population cooperates with this process to help you identify who did this and what, then it will be very difficult to bring perpetrators to justice. And I have to warn about, after 2003, de-Baathification was, getting rid of the members of Ba'ath Party was a big problem, contributed to, in the way it was dealt with, to giving us the problem of today. Actually, the day after of this problem, the liberated areas, I think this is our problem, going after who was labeled as collaborating with ISIS, and then what will be the ramification for the political process, for the stabilization, could be the next cycle of the problem. So putting energy and resources and building it bottom up, tapping into both what the system can do, but also really getting the community to work with this issue, because they have seen it in the most painful way now. They have been displaced, they have been seeing their people killed. I think there could be an opening to tap into that and build upon that. But just we leave it like this, I think it will fester, and this will be the underestimated problem that we had. Many people underestimated what the vacuum in Iraq could give us, ISIS in its current form. And then there was an underestimation of what the damage that ISIS can do and the response it needed. I think the post-ISIS situation also is probably underestimated right now and could use more attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much. One of the purposes of our recent trip was also to look at issues relating to accountability and justice, hence our recommendation around the need to prioritize transitional justice. And just very briefly, I think there's 5 points that I'd make. The first is there is a need for there to be an independent international investigation into what happened, to ensure that there can be the collection of evidence and the preservation of evidence and their analysis in accordance with international standards, to help establish truth, to help families identify what happened to their loved ones, and to push for future prosecutions and accountability. The second is that there needs to be an investment in supporting the capacity building and rule of law efforts of the government of Iraq and the Kurdish regional government. That's needed immediately, but it will have long-term benefits to ensure that the rule of law actually means something, and that minority communities feel that should their rights be violated in the future, they can resort to courts and not have to take up other means to protect themselves. The third is both the government of Iraq and the Kurdish regional government currently lack legislation that allows them to prosecute genocide. There is an effort underway to create such legislation. The political will to do so is mixed. There's an important role that the international community can play in pushing for the enactment of that legislation so that we could possibly see cases brought at the national level. The fourth, as I mentioned earlier, is the importance and priority that should be placed on local cases, trying people for murder, for these kind of property seizures, for what happened in their own communities. And there's an important issue that arises on that. It requires the detaining of people and the investigation for future prosecutions. Now, many Islamic State fighters tend to blow themselves up or are killed on the battlefield. It's unclear for those who are being detained by different forces what's happening to them. We need to do a better job of trying to arrest people, ensure that there can be future prosecutions with them. That's going to be very pertinent when we see a liberation of Mosul. And it's going to raise a lot of challenging human rights questions about the vetting of people as they flee Mosul and ensuring that not all Sunni Arabs are stopped and detained and assumed that they are Islamic State supporters, but that those who have actually committed crimes are actually held responsible. And then finally, to underscore the point that Sarhang made about the critical need to support local civil society that is undertaking these efforts to do documentation, but also to do the conflict management and mediation and reconciliation work that will be so critical to ensuring that we don't see a further recurrence of atrocities.
Thank you, Ms. Bassett. Thank you. Just some final questions. Mr. Anderson, you pointed out in your testimony that American policy should recognize the important differences in the situations of those fleeing violence and those targeted for genocide, and we should prioritize the latter. And I would add with emphasis, especially since the administration has made the designation of genocide against Christians and other minority faiths. Consider this analogy you point out. After World War II, there were approximately 50 million refugees. Only a small fraction were Jews, yet the world understood that Jews who had survived genocide faced a qualitatively different situation and deserved heightened consideration. I believe strongly, and if you want to elaborate on that, that you could put exclamation points on that for the Christians, the Yazidis, today, when they can't even get into a UNHCR IDP camp or a refugee camp, are unwanted, at risk. And as you pointed out, a news report showed or indicated that of the 499 Syrian refugees admitted to the United States in May, not one, I repeat and say again, not one, was listed as being Christian or as explicitly coming from any of the groups targeted for genocide. To me, that has got to change. I mean, that is unconscionable. It's not like we haven't been raising this for, in my case, 3 years. In the cases of so many others, 3 years. And we've had hearing after hearing, and you talk about protecting, and I really, Ms. Kikola, your point about civilian protection, as being a core, I think is very well placed. It has not been, and maybe you might want to elaborate on, do you sense that it's becoming a core protection, especially in light of the genocide a statement? And let me also ask about the idea of stabilization. And again, there's so much overlap. Great minds think alike, and you five have provided expert testimony, and there are a number of areas where there's an overlap of concern and recommendation. I chair the Commission on Security Cooperation in Europe and have been very involved for years on Bosnia. Was actually in Vukovar right before it fell, before Serbia conquered it 3-4 weeks before it fell, and worked very hard with the Yugoslav court to hold people who committed those atrocities to account. Well, the whole idea of stabilization, one of our own members of the full committee, Scott Perry, was part of the stabilization force, and can tell you, as was mentioned earlier by Professor Crane, we're still in Korea. The stabilization force, it took years. And I remember being in burnt-out homes throughout Bosnia. I was actually in Srebrenica, where the genocide against Muslims occurred, which was horrific. I was there for one of the reinterment ceremonies. My point being, we do have to plan for that post-conflict when there is a liberated area. I'm concerned we're not doing the kind of aggressive planning that's necessary. Because we had forces on the ground in Tuzla and elsewhere, we did a lot of that. It still wasn't perfect. But get this, as of yesterday, and I had a hearing on Bosnia, there's still approximately 800 people who committed horrific crimes in Bosnia, mostly against Muslims, who the criminal court for the former Yugoslavia devolved to the local courts, and they have not one have been taken up. The importance of the courts can't be overstated as a means of meting out justice and giving the survivors at least some peace that their next-door neighbor or the guy that's 1 block away wasn't someone who was putting bullets in the heads of family members or committing acts of torture. I mean, I do meet frequently with these folks in Bosnia, and if we don't have a lessons learned from all of that, shame on us. So all the more reason why a court needs to be set up. And I really, really appreciate, again, Professor, your point about the cornerstone of a possible beginning of a solution is to get Arab resolve and cooperation. The ideal of having Arab states prosecuting Arabs for crimes against Arab peoples in violation of Arab laws. Yeah, the idea that it needs to have ownership, and I think that's a very, very important point. We want to lend and assist. And again, on capacity, as was mentioned by some of our witnesses, you in Sierra Leone left not only well-trained prosecutors and people who understood rule of law and how to garner evidence and present it in court, you left buildings where people could work and do the important work of justice. And I think all the more reasons why we need to push that. But if you could speak, to these questions that I'm raising, all of you, or some of you, however you like, I would appreciate it. Maybe start with you, Mr. Anderson, on this. We've got the designation. Why aren't Christians being focused upon? There's no religious test here. I think the president erred when he said we don't have a religious test. When the Jackson-Vanik passed and the Soviet Union and Jews were escaping the horrific psychiatric prisons of the Soviet Union, I actually went to Perm Camp 35, where a number of political and religious prisoners were. It's terrible. We saved thousands, hundreds of thousands of Jews through limiting MFN to the Soviet Union based on focusing on Jewish people who were being so persecuted by the Soviet Union. We're talking about minority faiths here. We need to redouble our efforts, and you pointed out to the Tom Cotton bill, and thank you for that, but maybe you want to elaborate, if you would.
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chairman, and especially for your leadership for so many years on this. And let me just, it goes without saying, every human life has dignity, has sanctity. We should do whatever we can to support each individual who's in these tragic situations. And of course, the help that we're doing, as I mentioned, helping Yazidis, helping Muslims, there's not a distinction of helping the individuals. But I think we have to realize a basic reality here, that there are minority indigenous communities that have been in these lands for thousands of years, and they are going to be extinguished. And that is a different qualitative reality. And so what the world has to ask itself is, are we going to allow that to happen? Are we going to allow it to happen? And therefore, if the decision is no, we're not going to allow this, then we have to make special efforts. We have to give special attention to preserve these communities. It's just as simple as that. Nobody wants to apply a religious test. But the fact is, these people, these communities, this heritage will be gone unless we do something extra to save it.
Address any of those questions? Yes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Again, I commend you for your leadership in spending so many years in this respective body fighting for religious freedoms throughout the world. Mr. Anderson is correct. The Assyrian and the Chaldean communities of Iraq and Syria do face extinction. But another problem that I would like to touch on is the central government in Baghdad. After the war, the Coalition Provisional Authority, dialogue with the Iraqis and basically implementing Article 125, when the redrafting of the Constitution with Article 125 of the Iraqi Constitution, which basically talked about the protection of the Iraq's Christian minorities. Article 125 is a moot point right now. The Iraqi government has failed in upholding its constitutional duties. When the Islamic State came barreling through the many towns and villages of the Nineveh Plains, the Iraqi army, you know, what, 50, 60,000 and some odd, to about 10, 9,000 thugs basically surrendered and basically relinquished their weapons and their arms and clothing and uniform and fled. That is basically basically negligence on the Iraqi government's part. We can basically, you know, sit here and point fingers about, you know, they did this and play the blame game, but let's move forward. I urge that this Congress basically urge the Iraqi government to step up to the plate and help these communities. Everything from financial assistance to each individual that has been impacted, because again, the Iraqi government has a moral and fundamental responsibility to protect its citizens, and they failed. Thank you.
Thank you. If I could, and Professor Crane, if you could, in addition to those questions, in your statement you talk about how the Syracuse Syrian Accountability Project, which you founded. Over the past 5+ years, we have built a trial package that a domestic, regional, or international prosecutor can consider in developing a case against all parties committing atrocity in the Levant. This package includes a conflict map, crime-based matrix, and other associated documents to include sample indictments. And you point out how you use that very same technique in successfully prosecuting Charles Taylor and other henchmen. Could you maybe elaborate on that? Because that is absolutely, you know, vital, I think, to the future of successful prosecution. And I mean, it's not like it all has to be reinvented. Don't reinvent the wheel. You have, you know, ready-made tools here.
Well, I think it's, excuse me, I think it's very important that we do understand that we've made great strides in the past 20 years in international criminal law. Most of this was theory when I was in law school, or not even taught because it didn't even exist. What we do now, we have this capacity, the rules of evidence, the practical experience, and the jurisprudence to prosecute and hold accountable any individual who commits atrocities, international crimes. Again, the bright red thread of all of this is politics, and that's always a challenge related to dealing with these types of issues. But at the end of the day, because we have this practical experience now of taking down and holding accountable a head of state, his henchmen, for what they've done to a region, we need to continue to work together to use those techniques so that someday, whether it be tomorrow, next year, or 10 years, we'll have that ability then to hold accountable those who've destroyed this area of the world. And so we do have a conflict map. We have literally developed a criminal history of the Syrian conflict and in the Levant since March of 2011. We continue to monitor that and write that chapter. We also have that crime-based matrix, which lists by date, time, location, perpetrator, as well as the specific violation of the Rome Statute, international humanitarian laws such as the Geneva Conventions, and we've translated the Syrian Criminal Code, which is a good criminal code, one that could be used as a basis for domestic prosecutions, into English. And so we have also identified by paragraph and line the violations of Syrian law as well. That particular aspect of the Syrian Accountability Project now numbers over 7,000 pages. In fact, there's so much of it that we've put it into a memory stick because I can't transport that around. In fact, the chairman knows I gave him a copy of that last week. Now, we share this. This is not all about the Syrian Accountability Project at Syracuse University College of Law. This is about justice for the people of Syria. So we share all of this data and have since March of 2011 with our colleagues in the United Nations, various key countries such as the United States, our friends in the War Crimes Office there, along with the International Criminal Court. I personally give this data to the Chief Prosecutor, Fatou Bensouda, as well. So we're sharing. We're working with other important accountability organizations to work together to make sure that, again, at the end of the day, it's about the victims and justice for the victims. But one caution here. 10, 12 years ago when I was investigating West Africa, we went out did it the old way. Cops going out, gathering evidence, taking statements and what have you. Now, with this social media age, we are inundated by a tsunami of information. It's too much. The challenge now is not finding the evidence. The evidence is now finding the evidence in a haystack. 99.9% of the data coming out of Syria in whatever capacity being held by whatever organization is not evidence. We cannot use it in a court of law. I think that's really important for us to understand. It's in a great historical body of information. It is important in many other ways, but it can't be used in court. And I think we tend to forget that we have all this information, but it's just information. It's not evidence. And so I think we have to be very, very careful when we say we have cases against all these individuals. The answer is we may have cases against these individuals, and we have to be very, very careful. But again, that's up to a prosecutor, a local, regional, or international prosecutor to take this and hopefully take our trial package and use it in whatever way he or she can use it in order to seek justice for the people of the Levant region.
Before we conclude, anything else that any witness would like? Yes, Ms. Kilcolor.
Thank you. Maybe just in light of the question that you asked about the integration of civilian protection, I think it's really important to underscore that defeating ISIS but failing to prevent atrocities and provide adequate security to all Iraqis will likely fuel future grievances, a proliferation of armed groups, and continued conflict. In our original report, we highlighted that the current counterterrorism and counterinsurgency paradigms don't prioritize an assessment of or compel a response to, in a systematic way, the unique threats and risks of mass atrocities that local populations and individuals may face. So as a result, going forward, we do feel that it's important to prioritize the mapping of the motivations, organizations, and capabilities of perpetrators and the vulnerabilities of at-risk communities. Finding proactive ways to identify where these communities are. Our report focused on Iraq. There are communities in Syria that remain at risk. Mapping their location, tracking the movement and mobilization of potential perpetrators, and identifying other actors that enable or inhibit the perpetration of mass atrocity crimes. This includes intelligence gathering and analysis that plays a critical role in developing the strategies that will be used to provide protection for communities and prevent future atrocities going forward.
Could I ask you on that parallel, if you would? Would a safe haven is that more of a surface appeal, but strewn with a number of challenges that may make it unachievable, or is it something that ought to be, in your opinion, promoted?
I think from our perspective, there are a host of questions that need to be asked about how to provide protection, and we don't necessarily go into military strategies at the museum ourselves. I think the questions that can be asked about areas like safe havens and other options are, what are the specific threats facing civilian populations? What are the resources that are needed to provide protection? What are the various options that are available to ensure that over a sustained period of time, communities will be protected? And a host of other scenarios. In the case of northern Iraq, one of the things that we have highlighted is the need to focus on addressing the deep distrust that communities feel towards others, and recognizing that the areas that we're talking about are not ethnically or religiously homogenous. Communities live alongside each other, and any discussion about local administration, physical protection, has to take into account those realities in that particular area. But I think others would probably be more well-versed.
Yes.
Yep. So I think that it's important to look at the different scenarios. The scenarios we talked about, the protracted stay, but also the scenario of return. And the return, right now, the whole system is struggling with providing food and assistance. So that's the level of need we're talking about. And in the scenario of return, there's a physical protection of those people. And then ideas such as safe havens and all of that, there are practicality elements that need to be taken into consideration. Okay, what objective will that serve? So in the past, a safe haven against a system like Saddam Hussein could have a systemic protection would have been helpful, But right now, the threat is far more retail in the sense of you have a terror organization that knows no boundaries. And then you have the fear of revenge that is at actually individual and tribal and family level sometimes. That is where, a safe haven or the concept of protection and physical protection just changes how you deliver that. This is where the better relationship with the neighboring communities and working on that becomes necessary. And I think one of the things that could be helpful for the Iraqi minorities, it is important as they make this case, as they present solutions, some of the solutions will create other problems, will create other conflicts and other competition. It is important that at this moment of frustration, in this moment of anger, and it's a lot, and they have every right to be angry and frustrated and disappointed. But getting back to what Mr. Crane said about achievable programs and achievable objectives, it is important to look at what there's a framework solution for Iraq. Without fixing that, the minorities will always be caught in between those. I would like to stress that the military approach is probably important for certain problems, but it will not solve the long term. And preserving those communities, you may be physically safe if you relocate to the Kurdistan region or you relocate to outside, but preserving the community as a community, and the Sabian Mandayans their numbers have dropped over the years to about a couple of thousand worldwide. Mm-hmm. This is how you lose a community. The Christians have seen their numbers drop from about 1.5 million in 2003 now to about less than a third of that in Iraq. The numbers are such. So preserving the sense of community will require for the minorities to be striking those relationships with those Iraqi communities for the long term, but also the civil society can, and the external assistance could go also into preserving those communities in terms of education, in terms of programs that will provide services to those areas. And this is what the Alliance of Iraqi Minorities have been very successful, working with the Iraqi government and with the Kurdistan Regional Government. Those efforts could help the minorities help themselves, be the voice of the community, and engage the international actors. And thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Orm.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for touching on the safe haven question. Right now, a good number of our people do not want to return back to their villages and towns in Nineveh Plains because they've lost the confidence and the trust of not only their government, but remember, a lot of their Sunni neighbors in the villages essentially marked them for death. They basically went ahead and etched on the big N for Nazarene, identifying them as Christian families. But the only way for an effective safe haven mechanism is obviously laying a foundation for the successful liberation of Mosul, which is basically the gateway of Iraq's Christian region. And also to ensure that, that the Assyrian communities of northern Iraq enjoy their own self-autonomous identity, their own affairs, and as well as a security apparatus through the support of our government. That's the only way, and if that's the only way that they can have their confidence and their hopes restored, by having a security mechanism in place, their own autonomy, dictating their own policies and what have you. This is extremely important for a long-term effort for fulfilling a safe haven for our communities in northern Iraq. And that's why it's important now to address some of the, and this is going to be a long process. And so I think right now we really need to identify the current situation at hand with respect to the IDPs, the violence and the harassment, the lack of aid that they are receiving, as well as reforming our Refugee Act of 1980, the designating new visas, the P2 and the P3 visas for many of these Christian families to come to the United States. And a lot of them have relatives and friends and families in the United States. They can come back here and then and join them. This is important, but I think it should be a part of our long-term foreign policy strategy to preserve Christianity in the Middle East. We are the oldest in civilization. That we are the indigenous peoples, and it is vital to America's national security to make sure that this is reached. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
I want to thank each and every one of you for your time, your leadership, taking the time to present very, very incisive testimonies to the committee, and we will share this with a large number of people, so thank you, and look forward to working with you going forward. Hearing's adjourned.